Our reading for this morning is a poem entitled Prayer. It's by Katja Kuipers. Perhaps as a child, you had the chicken pox, and your mother, to soothe you in your fever or to help you fall asleep, came into your room and read to you from some favorite book, Charlotte's Web or Little House on the Prairie, a long story that she quietly took you through until your eyes became magnets for your shuddering lids, and she saw your breathing go slow. And then she read on, this time silently to herself. Not because she didn't know the story. It seemed to her that there was never a time when she didn't know this story. The young girl and her benevolence, the girl in her sod house. But because she did not yet want to leave your side, though she knew there was nothing more that she could do for you. And you, not asleep, but simply weak, listened to her turn the pages, still feeling the lamp warm against one cheek, knowing the shape of the rocking chair's shadow as it slid across your chest. So that now, many years later, when you are clenched in the damp fist of a hospital bed, or signing the papers that say that you won't love him anymore, when you are bent at your son's gravesite, or haunted by a war that makes you wake with the gun cocked in your hand, you would like to believe that such generosity comes from God too. God who now, when you have the strength to ask, might begin the story again, just as your mother would, from the place where you have both left off. I have something to admit to all of you. I have not always liked talking about prayer practices. When I was in seminary and my professors would start talking about spiritual disciplines or daily devotional habits or prayer practices, I would feel myself slowly falling into a semi-comatose state of boredom, just like drooping in my seat. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love spiritual practices. I love having a vibrant spiritual life. These things are obviously important to me because here I am, having spent a decade of my life devoted to spiritual practices and having a vibrant faith life. The issue for me is the way that people so often talk about spiritual practice. It sounds boring. As a matter of fact, a lot of it sounds like a chore, like say your prayers, brush your teeth, like just not something exciting that you want to have as part of your daily life. And it's worse even for me, or it has been in the past, when people started talking about disciplines. I have made peace with this term, spiritual disciplines, in large part because there is a wonderful group of people here at New Garden Friends Meeting and they meet every first day to talk about spiritual disciplines. And that when that group meets, they seem to be talking about spiritual practice and spiritual disciplines in a way that is creative and wise and fun. And in large part because of this group, I have come to be at peace with this term spiritual disciplines. But before coming to New Garden Friends Meeting, I deeply disliked the term spiritual disciplines because a discipline sounds even worse than a chore. It sounds like a rule that people have to follow. Now, I will admit something to all of you. I am a quintessential Quaker in that I do not like rules or anything that smacks too much of somebody telling me how I am supposed to connect with the divine. I don't want to be told how I should talk to God. I don't want to be told what my practice should look like or how I should be connecting with God on a daily basis. I don't think that it helps that so many of the resources on spiritual practice, even the ones written by Quakers, were written by men. The ones that were written by women, some of those are even worse, because they seem to suggest that there is a womanly way to connect to God. I have to tell you that I am so tired of books written for women about how chores can be part of your spiritual practice, how dishwashing can be a time for prayer. How about instead we talk about negotiating equal pay as a spiritual practice? How about that? I think in large part because overwhelmingly these resources were written by men, I have mostly found them to be completely useless for me. But you might be wondering how I have come to be in this place, talking to all of you this first day and on so many others about spiritual practice, about prayer practice. The truth is that although I have never much liked conversations about spiritual practice, I have fallen in love with spiritual practices on my own terms. When I was in college, I began to realize that there were times when I felt deeply centered, times other than when I was in meeting for worship. I would feel deeply centered as I was taking walks or listening to music or swimming laps in the pool, when I was working with clay or drawing, when I was having coffee and talking to friends about God and faith, when I was looking at the stars at night, or when I was swinging on the swing that hangs on the heart at Earlham College. These moments started to be moments of profound worship for me. And I started to think about them as my spiritual practices, as my habits of faith. When I went to seminary and started to worship on campus regularly, I fell in love with the rhythms of liturgical prayer. So gradually, I started to come up with my own prayers, words that I would say again and again, words that brought comfort and meaning to my faith life. I would turn them over in my heart as I said them. I had long ago learned to say the Catholic Rosary, and I would often say that as part of my practice, or I would just say the Hail Mary part of the Rosary. Those words became important for me, and the Hail Mary prayer was the one that I said again and again to help me be centered as I was in labor with both of my children. In seminary, I continued to walk as part of my spiritual practice. I continued to turn to music, and I loved to read the Psalms. That rhythm of praise and lament became a rhythm that was healing for my heart. I would still often do art or would write. And gradually, all of these practices became woven together. They became the habits of my spiritual life. As a pastor, it's part of my professional life to have robust spiritual practices. I learned in my professional life as a pastor, I learned that I loved to draw and pray, that I loved to hold people in the light as I wrote them cards by hand, real cards that I sent through the mail with stamps. As a millennial, I never anticipated I would spend so much time actually writing cards and mailing them. I also learned that I love to walk through the cemetery and the woods. First, the cemetery that was close by the first meeting where I served as pastor, and then the cemetery here at New Garden Friends meeting. As I would walk, I would think of the people who had passed away and their loved ones who were still present with us, and I would hold them in the light. Here at New Garden Friends meeting, I have established a new spiritual practice. We have a very large meeting house here, and during the week, often large parts of the meeting house are quiet. So during the week, I will often walk from room to room in the meeting house, and as I walk, I will pray for the members of the community. There's something special about sitting in the tiny little child-size chairs that we have downstairs in our nursery space, and while sitting there, praying for all of the children of our community. There's something special about lying down underneath the piano in our worship room and looking up at the strings and thinking about all the musicians in our community and sending them light and love. There's something beautiful about being in our library, sitting on the floor surrounded by all of our Quaker books and holding in the light all of the educators within our community. I walk through our meeting house and room by room, I think of all of you and I send you light and love. And it has become part of my spiritual practice, my spiritual habits to do it this way. I have discovered that prayer does not need to be, and indeed should not be, prescriptive. No one can tell you what your spiritual practices should be. Instead, it is a process of discovery and rediscovery, to slowly uncover what makes you feel whole and what helps you reach down into that living center. This discovery begins with these questions. When do you feel grounded in the spirit? When do you feel at home with the divine? Once you answer these questions, you can ask next, what are you doing in those moments? What are you listening to? Who are you with? These questions will give you clues as to what is feeding your heart and your soul in this moment, this season in time. Our spiritual practices can and should change with the seasons of our lives, with our emotional and spiritual needs. So this process is one of rediscovery, of asking again and again these questions and finding new answers to them. You have to be creative and experimental. Finger painting is just as valid as a spiritual practice as saying Hail Marys. And I guess in saying that, it is now very clear that I am not a Catholic. I wonder sometimes about these creative practices. And I think sometimes that you can encounter God with just as much force while you're playing with Play-Doh as while you are reading the Bible. And if you think that that's maybe not true, I would encourage you to stretch yourself and try it. That stretch, that try, that willingness to reach outside of yourself, outside of your preconceived notions. I think that's the groundwork for a vibrant spiritual life. You have to be willing to stretch outside of yourself. God, I think, is so rarely encountered within the structure of what you already know. Because God cannot be defined by our knowing, by our understanding. It has been my experience that the Spirit is wild and fierce, that the Spirit is unpredictable, that the Spirit is disruptive to the systems that we have in place in our world, to that business as usual pattern of doing things. The Spirit is disruptive to things that are comfortable for us, things that are easy, whether they are actions or thoughts or habits. Instead, I think the Spirit is an untamed thing, undomesticated and fierce. And really, thank goodness for that, because all of us, we are all messy and fallible. And I think if God could only be encountered in disciplines that were prescribed and had to be followed carefully down to the letter, if God could only be encountered in that way, then so many of us would never encounter the divine. I think it is a wonderful and beautiful truth that the Spirit is in a dance with us, moving again and again to encounter us in new ways and in new actions. So this is my encouragement to all of you this first day. And really, this is the sum total of all wisdom that I have about prayer practices. So this is it. This is all I've got. My encouragement to all of you is to stretch yourself. Stretch yourself outside of what you are familiar with and be creative and allow space for newness. Know that what you will need spiritually will change season to season in your life, and allow yourself the ability to change and to change again. Above all else, know that the divine is always reaching for you. That God in every moment is reaching out, wanting to connect with you. That God's love is unceasing and unwavering. And that the divine is always very, very near. Just around the corner, waiting for you to reach out in turn. Seek on, my friends, and do not be limited. Seek on and be creative. Seek on because the divine wants to dance with us.